Grant, for almost 30 years, has served as a historian and curator of the Banting House National Historic Site in Canada. Grant was instrumental in securing the Banting House as a National Historic Site. He served as historical consultant for the Royal Canadian Mint's coin commemorating Banting as Canada's first Nobel Prize recipient. Grant is also a representative of Diabetes Canada. His most recent article appears this month in the Lancet, Diabetes and Endocrinology, commemorating the 100th anniversary of Sir Dr. Frederick Banting's discovery of insulin. So anyway, Grant, the floor is all yours.
Well, thanks, Brian, and good morning, everyone. Greetings from Banting House National Historic Site of Canada, the birthplace of insulin. 2 weeks ago, on October 31st, we marked the 100th anniversary of the most important breakthrough in the history of diabetes research and management, Banting's 2 a.m. revelation in this very room that led to the discovery of insulin and lifted the death sentence for those suffering from diabetes worldwide. For many, the discovery of insulin is looked at from the perspective of a single photograph, that famous Banting, Best, and the dog on the rooftop at the University of Toronto. But like any other story, that image is neither the beginning nor is it the end. In fact, I'm not sure it's even the first dog. I once saw a photograph, Banting had signed the back of it, and he wrote, "Me, Charlie, and some mud on the roof." I think they may have been caught up in the realization that they had made this significant breakthrough and had no photographic memory of it. And so they may have staged a photo or two, we're not sure. But it's an interesting story nonetheless, and it's something that everyone's aware of. And our role here is to expand on that knowledge of this great story. It started 100 years ago in this house. So I didn't want to use my time with you this morning to go over that traditional point-by-point narrative around the discovery of insulin, what happened in Toronto. There'll be plenty of time for that next year in 2021 when we celebrate the centenary of the discovery of insulin. What I thought I'd do today is take a brief look at a couple of the key highlights that led to the discovery of insulin, what happened here at Banting House, and then sort of conclude with the legacy of the discovery of insulin and the importance of Banting House to people around the world. Where you see, as I mentioned, without this bedroom where I'm standing right now, there is no University of Toronto story. There is no 1921 discovery of insulin either. We can trace the discovery's origins back to 1552 BCE in ancient Egypt on what's known as the Ebers Papyrus. Found in 1872, this document is considered the oldest surviving medical text. And on this text, we found what we believe is a prescription for someone who has, quote, sweet-smelling urine. In subsequent centuries, we saw numerous breakthroughs in describing this disease and then later diagnosis, but it really stopped. So in a modern context, we talk about breakthroughs in diabetes research. Well, in the first 2,000 years, we had maybe 6, and 2 of those involved one, we called it diabetes. And then we added mellitus about 300 years later. And so when we, one of our roles here is to put that research in perspective. Everyone's saying, well, Banting came up with this idea, why don't we have something today? Well, this is a complicated disease. And as I say, it took almost 4,500 years to come up with the idea that actually led to the discovery of insulin. So for centuries, we can describe the disease. Finally, we get to this point where we can diagnose the disease, but there's really no real treatment until about the 1870s, out of the Franco-Prussian War, and when there's food rationing. And this is the era of the diets. And like today, we have these fad diets. There's the rice cure, the oatmeal diet. There was the opium diet, which I think more just addressed people's pain than actually treating any kind of aspect of the disease. By the early 1920s, the accepted treatment was the diet created by Dr. Frederick Allen, and it was nothing more than a starvation diet. Once you're on this diet, your life expectancy is generally 6 months to 2 years, although there were some children who would go on to live almost 5 years. So take a moment, imagine, if you will, the emotion that parents must have felt when they chose to let their children starve. You're holding out hope that somewhere, someone is going to come up with something. You had two choices with a diagnosis. We put you on this diet, and eventually the child will slip into a coma and die. Or we can starve them, as I said, hope for something to come up. The discovery of insulin changed that prognosis and leads us to the question, how did we get there? So we'll go back to 1919. Frederick Banting is returned from Europe in the Great War, a war hero, Military Cross winner. He returns to Toronto and he is demobilized in September of 1919. He's been working at a veterans hospital. And he returned to the University of Toronto to complete his medical school studies. It was his ultimate goal to become the house surgeon at the Sick Kids Hospital in Toronto. But by the time he came back and was demobilized, we already had 2 graduating class of medical school students, plus we had some of the physicians who returned from the war earlier. Surgeons were plentiful, and no positions were possible for him in Toronto. So on the advice of his mentor, he was encouraged to move here to London, Ontario. It made sense. There are only a couple of orthopedic surgeons here. One needs to know one per university, is an up-and-coming medical school, so potentially there's options there. 2 hospitals where he might seek privileges. Seemed to make sense. And reason number 4, his fiance, in Ingersoll, which is about 15, 20 minutes east of here. And she really was reason number 4. So he purchases this house in June of 1920, opens the door on July 1st, and his first patient doesn't arrive until July 28th. This wasn't an open it and they will come. It's really, if you could do anything wrong, he did. He doesn't take over a retired doctor's practice in a city where he doesn't know anyone. His location isn't great. It's not a high traffic area. You put a name in your front window, but for people walking by, but unfortunately there's this beautiful silver maple tree in front, so no one's going to see it from the sidewalk. Phone book would be a good way to go, but the problem is the phone book was printed in April and he moved here in June. So he's literally 0 for 4. On the 28th day, an army officer is going to reunion with his men, and he comes knocking. And Banting writes them the prescription. And he talks of this in his memoir. He says, he was an honest soldier and he wanted to give his men a drink. I thought myself rather good at the barkeeping business today. I wrote in the prescription and felt good about it. What makes that story interesting, especially for us up here, is Ontario was still under the Prohibition Act. Our great Canadian hero started off his career as a bootlegger, selling illegal alcohol. How many on this call remember the phrase, a shot for medicinal purposes? His hours were also very good, 1 to 3 in the afternoon, 7 to 8 in the evening. So if you're having difficulty getting in touch with your physician today, imagine that Frederick Banting was yours. The practice slowly starts to grow, and Western University comes calling, and they need demonstrators in surgery, physiology, anatomy, and Banting says, I will do it because it's $2 an hour. He does 3 labs in that first week of October. He will equal his entire July income, which was $6, 2 of it illegal alcohol. Not good when he owed $700-800 on the house. In late October, he was asked to prepare a lecture on the subject of the pancreas and carbohydrate metabolism, a subject he admitted to knowing very little about. Banting had never treated a patient with diabetes. He didn't know his best friend had diabetes. He only had 1 paragraph of notes from medical school. We think the pancreas is involved. We know the pancreas is involved, but we're not sure how. You get it late teens, early 20s, and once you're diagnosed, life expectancy is short. So you can't do much of a lecture on 3 or 4 sentences. So to the medical school he goes, he reads everything he can and prepares his lecture on the 30th of October. That night when he goes to bed, as his usual practice, he reads himself to sleep. And he takes to bed a surgical journal, and there's this article by Moses Barron, and it's a survey article on diabetes. Maybe I should read it. Maybe I can incorporate it into my lecture. So he reads the article, turns out the light, 2 o'clock in the morning, he comes up with it. And we're really fortunate in his unpublished memoir, he reflected on that evening. Quote, it was one of those nights when I was disturbed and could not sleep. I thought about the lecture and about the article, and I thought about my miseries and how I'd like to get away from debt and worry. Finally, at about 2 in the morning, after the lecture and the article had been chasing each other in my mind for some time, the idea occurred to me. I got up, I wrote down the idea, and I spent the rest of the night thinking about it. The words that he wrote set in motion a chain of events that would lead to the discovery of insulin, the most important Canadian medical discovery of the 20th century. With facilities lacking in London, he was forced to go to the University of Toronto. And here's where the Toronto story that everybody knows. He is not expected to succeed. He's given a graduate student, Charles Best, and they start their first experiment on May 17th, 1921. On July 30th, dog 410, a dog that had diabetes, was given a crude extract, and the dog's blood glucose dropped. We have success, and then we have failure because the dog died. There are too many impurities in this extract. Banting and Best just couldn't separate the extract for successful trials. It would take another 6 months after J.B. Collip, our first Canadian-born professor of biochemistry, joins the team. On January 23rd, 1922, so almost 6 months to the day of that first dog trial, a more purified form of the extract was tested in Leonard Thompson, a 14-year-old boy. Success was immediate and lasting. Leonard would live another 13 years. The death sentence for those suffering from diabetes was now lifted. On October 25th, 1923, so 6 days shy, sorry about that. You have your phone, excuse me. 6 months, so I apologize for that, technology at its finest. So on October 25th, 1923, so we're 6 days shy of that October 31st epiphany, Banting became Canada's first Nobel Prize winner for this discovery. He made at age 29. So he's 31 years old. He's, to this day, the youngest to ever win the Nobel Prize in physiology or medicine. Upset that his assistant, Charles Best, wasn't recognized, Banting publicly shared half of his prize money with him. MacLeod then shared half of his prize money with Collip, and there should have been glory enough for all. But as society tends to, when you have multiple people, we gravitate to one or two, and Banting was the person that people did gravitate to. He becomes the first Canadian on the cover of Time within weeks of this Nobel announcement. Banting then returns to London on the 31st of October and speaks to the Canadian Club here. And it's a wonderful speech. He gives London and Western partial credit. But an interesting statement he makes in the talk is, 3 years ago today with my idea, I became engaged to diabetes. 2 years ago last May when the experiments commenced, I was wed. Today with the Nobel Prize, I'm applying for my divorce from diabetes. And he didn't return. He left diabetes research by 1924 and really tried to distance himself from that. And one occasion in the late 30s, he was asked about a breakthrough in diabetes research from England, and his reply was, diabetes, never heard of it before. He turned around and walked away. When Canadian and American papers called this house the birthplace of insulin in 1923, they also called for it to be turned into a museum and given a national plaque. That great Canadian tradition. It took us 86 years to finally do it. In our story at Banting House, there's nothing more authentic than this room. And well, it's as close as we can get. We have the original wallpaper behind me. The most important thing is the bed. It's his, not the mattress, but the frame. And I can't emphasize how important it is to our visitors. It's our most photographed room. It's our spiritual room. It's our crying room. It's our raison d'etre, and it really speaks to the importance of place. I could tell you the stories of families coming to get their picture taken in the room who want to touch the bed, or the scientists who sheepishly ask if it would be okay for them to sit on it. Often they'll just lean against it because, in museums you're not supposed to touch anything, and we do let them know that it's okay, that they can be photographed with it. I had one such scientist from Argentina. He sat on the bed and then laid down. Something that we don't encourage, and so he regains his composure and he says, "You'll never know what this means to me. I've been doing diabetes research for more than 30 years. This is the greatest moment in my field. Maybe now that I've been here, maybe now I can finish Banting's work." Well, with close to 460 million people with diabetes around the world today, if you think a power nap's going to help, sure, we'll let you stay. Then there's the young mother whose 10-month-old was diagnosed with type 1. Youngest in Southwestern Ontario, obviously quite overwhelmed. And she comes here to the Diabetes Canada offices. What's a glucometer? How can I find support? Is there funding for this? Where what can I eat? You know, it's just complete information overload. And she wanted to tour the museum. And we always bring people through. And when she comes to this room, she just sits on the bed and lets go. And that's okay. If you're crying in here, you get it. And you're not the first and you're not the last. And so about 10 minutes later, I came back and I got about a foot inside the room and she just looks at me, stands up, instantly dries up. No, thank you. I will never shed another tear over this. My child is going to live because of what happened in this room all those years ago. As we approach the 100th anniversary of the discovery of insulin, we're reminded that while we may have better insulin today, what we still don't have is anything better than insulin. The legacy of the discovery of insulin is simple. The diagnosis of diabetes is no longer a question of death. Rather, it's now about ensuring the quality of life of people affected by diabetes while we work together to end diabetes. Symbols are important. They reflect who we are, what we stand for, and their power to motivate people can never be underestimated. Today, Banting House, this very room, and the flame of hope which burns out front for all affected by diabetes and will remain lit until a cure for diabetes is found, represent powerful symbols of ingenuity and hope for the diabetes community. Banting's stay in London was a brief one, only about 10 months. But over the course of those 10 months, one episode would set in motion a chain of events that would change the course of medical history. It's because of the events of October 31st, 1920, Banting rose from obscurity in London, Ontario, to become one of the world's leading known and well-known scientists. And it's why in a pre-COVID era, thousands from around the world would make the annual pilgrimage to the Banting House. That is the importance of the place. Thank you for your attention. And thank you again for the Lions of California for the opportunity to present today. Thank you.